He was supposed to be packing for another tour, another long stretch of nights under stage lights, another chapter in a band whose music had already outlived generations. Instead, on a quiet Christmas, Perry Bamonte died at home. There was no hospital press conference, no dramatic final photograph, no warning to the outside world that this would be the end. Just days earlier, fans were still talking about the future, about shows that had yet to happen, about a guitarist who had returned to The Cure and seemed, at last, to have found his place again. He was scheduled to tour Europe in 2026. His hands were still meant for strings, not silence. So, what happened in those final hours? What unfolded in the private space where the music stopped, far from the stage, far from the crowd, far from the identity he had carried for 4 decades? This is not a story about a rock star collapsing in public. It is a story about a man who spent most of his life standing just outside the spotlight, and whose final moments passed almost entirely unseen. Tonight, we slow time down. We trace the last days, the last decisions, and the long road that led to that quiet Christmas ending, asking not just how Perry Bamonte died, but what his final hours reveal about fame, devotion, and the cost of living your life in service of someone else's sound. The announcement came quietly, almost deliberately understated. No breaking news countdown. No spectacle. Just a short statement confirming that Perry Bamonte had died after a brief illness, at home, over Christmas. And yet, within minutes, the shock rippled outward. For longtime fans of The Cure, the news landed with a strange sense of disbelief. Perry Bamonte was not the kind of figure people expected to read about in obituaries. He was not the frontman. He was not the scandal magnate. He was not the face printed on magazine covers. He was the constant presence at stage left, the musician who had been there, then gone, then somehow come back again. Social media filled with the same stunned refrain, but he was just there on stage in London, just there on tour, just there in the band's future plans. The Cure described him as quiet, intense, intuitive, constant, and hugely creative, calling him a vital part of the band's story. The wording mattered. This was not a generic tribute. It was a careful acknowledgement that much of what audiences heard and felt over decades had passed through Bamonte's hands. Tributes followed from fellow musicians, crew members, and fans who never met him but felt they knew him. They spoke less about fame and more about presence, about reliability, about someone who showed up night after night, carrying the emotional weight of songs that had become soundtracks to other people's lives. And then there was the detail that made the loss feel unfinished. Perry Bamonte had been scheduled to tour again in 2026. This was not a story of retirement or withdrawal. It was not framed as a farewell tour or a closing chapter. His return to The Cure in 2022 had been widely celebrated as a quiet redemption arc after years away. He was back inside the sound that had defined him. He had played dozens of shows, some described by the band as among the strongest performances in their history. The future, at least on paper, still existed. That contradiction between momentum and mortality became the emotional center of the public reaction. Fans were not just mourning a death, they were mourning a trajectory that had been abruptly cut off. As news outlets summarized his career, a pattern emerged. Article after article referred to him as longtime, key, integral. And yet many admitted, implicitly, that they had rarely centered him before this moment. His death forced a recalibration of memory. Who was Perry Bamonte really, and why had so much of his contribution lived in the background? The timing only deepened the sense of unease. Christmas is a season associated with gathering, warmth, and family. To die quietly at home during that time carries its own emotional weight. It suggested privacy. It suggested boundaries. It suggested a final chapter that unfolded away from the noise of the world he had served for most of his life. Almost immediately, questions surfaced, not accusatory, but human. Had anyone known how sick he was? How long had the illness lasted? Did he understand how close the end was? And what does it mean when someone who spent decades amplifying emotion through music leaves the world in near silence? There was no scandal, no investigation, no public conflict. And yet the impact was undeniable. For The Cure, it was the loss of a trusted musical anchor. For fans, it was the sudden removal of a familiar presence they had come to rely on without fully realizing it. For the broader music world, it was a reminder that some of the most essential figures are also the least visible until they are gone. To understand why Perry Bamonte's death resonated the way it did, you have to go back, not just to the beginning of his career, but to the particular role he chose to inhabit. The man behind the sound, the quiet force shaping moments that felt intensely personal to millions of strangers. Because his final hours cannot be separated from the life that led him there. And that life did not begin under stage lights. Long before Perry Bamonte ever stood on a stage with The Cure, long before his name appeared in liner notes or tour programs, his relationship with music began in far quieter spaces. He was born in London in September 1960, growing up in a city where music was not just entertainment, but atmosphere. By the time he was coming of age, Britain was already vibrating with post-punk tension bands emerging from the wreckage of the 1970 seconds with darker tones, sharper edges, and a refusal to pretend that optimism came easily. Perry Bamonte did not enter this world as a frontman in waiting. There was no early narrative of destined stardom. Instead, he gravitated toward the mechanics of music, the instruments, the equipment, the systems that made sound possible. While others dreamed of being seen, he learned how to make things work. That instinct would define the rest of his life. In the early 1980 seconds, as The Cure's reputation expanded beyond underground circles into something larger and stranger, Bamonte entered their orbit not as a musician, but as support. Through his brother, who worked as a tour manager, Perry joined the band's road crew. His job was invisible to audiences, but essential, keeping instruments playable, sounds consistent, shows functional. Night after night, he watched the same performances from the shadows. This proximity mattered. Bamonte was not simply fixing guitars. He was absorbing the emotional architecture of The Cure's music. He learned how songs breathed live, how tension built and released, how silence could be as powerful as noise. While fans focused on the figure at the center of the stage, Perry was learning the band's internal language, its rhythms, its fragilities, its unspoken rules. Years passed this way. By the mid to late 1980 seconds, The Cure were no longer just a cult band, they were global. Albums grew larger. Tours grew longer. The emotional weight of the music intensified, and with it, the complexity of performing it live. Bamonte remained behind the scenes, increasingly indispensable, increasingly trusted. Then, in 1990, everything shifted. When a key member left the band, Perry Bamonte did not return home or move on to another job. Instead, he stepped forward. The transition from technician to full member was not common in rock music. It required more than skill. It required acceptance, and it required a personality that could exist within a band known for its internal volatility. Bamonte fit because he did not demand space, he filled it. Suddenly, the man who had spent years making the show possible was part of the show itself. He played guitar, six-string bass, and keyboards roles that demanded flexibility and restraint rather than dominance. He became a stabilizing presence during a period when The Cure's sound was evolving, stretching between commercial success and emotional darkness. Albums released during this era carried that duality. Bright melodies masked melancholy, pop structures framed despair, and Bamonte's playing became one of the threads holding those contradictions together. To the public, he was still not a star. But within the band, his importance grew. Over the next decade and more, Perry Bamonte would perform hundreds of shows across continents. He stood on some of the largest stages in the world, yet rarely spoke. He let the music speak for him. His role was to support, reinforce, and expand what already existed, never to overwrite it. But there is a cost to living that way. To exist permanently in service of someone else's vision requires a particular kind of discipline. It also requires the suppression of ego, ambition, and sometimes identity. Bamonte's public image remained understated, but behind the scenes, the pressures of constant touring, long absences, and creative subordination accumulated quietly. By the early 2000s, The Cure began restructuring once again. The band reduced itself to a trio. Long-standing members were let go or stepped aside. In 2005, after more than a decade as a full member, Perry Bamonte was gone. There was no dramatic public fallout, no tabloid spectacle, just absence. For someone whose life had been built around presence, showing up, holding things together, filling gaps, that absence was profound. The man who had spent decades inside one of the most emotionally intense musical environments in modern rock suddenly found himself outside it. This was not the end of his relationship with music. Bamonte continued to create, to collaborate, to explore other artistic paths. But the rhythm of his life changed. The massive machinery of touring slowed. The spotlight receded. Years passed. And then, unexpectedly, history looped back on itself. In 2022, Perry Bamonte returned to The Cure. It was not announced as a triumphant comeback. There was no grand narrative attached. He simply stepped back into the role he had always occupied, quiet, intuitive, constant. Over the next 2 years, he would perform dozens of shows, re-entering the emotional terrain he knew better than almost anyone else. To many fans, it felt like restoration. What few could see was how much of his life, his identity, his sense of purpose had been shaped by cycles of belonging and removal, of being essential, then invisible, of being inside the sound, then outside it. Those patterns mattered, because when we look back at the final weeks of Perry Bamonte's life, we are not looking at an isolated moment of loss. We are looking at the culmination of a lifetime spent in service to music that demanded emotional endurance as much as technical skill. And the cracks that form under that kind of pressure are rarely visible from the stage. From the outside, Perry Bamonte's life looked unusually stable for someone who had spent decades inside one of the most emotionally demanding bands in modern music. There were no public meltdowns, no headline-grabbing addictions, no tabloid narratives that reduced his existence to spectacle, and yet, the absence of scandal does not mean the absence of strain. The Cure was never a casual environment. Its music was built on sustained emotional tension songs that lingered in grief, longing, regret, and introspection. To perform that material night after night was not simply an act of musicianship, it was an act of emotional labor. Bamonte was not playing background noise. He was helping deliver feelings that fans brought their own pain into. Touring amplified that burden. Months away from home, repetitive travel, disrupted sleep, constant performance at night followed by isolation afterward. For frontmen, that pressure often finds an outlet through visibility, interviews, personas, narratives of excess. For someone like Bamonte, whose role was defined by support rather than expression, the pressure had fewer release valves. He did not speak his way out of it. He played through it. Within the band, his value was reliability. He was trusted to adapt instantly, to cover shifts in arrangement, to anchor songs whose emotional tone could change from night to night. That trust, however, came with a quiet expectation. Consistency without complaint. When The Cure reconfigured in the mid-2000s and reduced themselves to a trio, the decision was framed musically. But for those removed from the lineup, the impact was deeply personal. For Bamonte, It meant the sudden loss of a structure that had organized most of his adult life. This kind of loss is difficult to quantify. It is not just about employment. It is about identity. About waking up without the rhythms that once defined you. About realizing that the place where you mattered most no longer has space for you. Bamonte did not disappear after leaving the band. He formed and joined other projects, including the supergroup Love Amongst Ruin. He explored visual art, illustration, and interests far removed from the machinery of arena tours. These were not retreats. They were attempts to build a life that did not depend entirely on one band's orbit. Still, the absence lingered. Friends and collaborators described him as introspective, reserved, deeply intuitive. Those qualities made him invaluable on stage, but they also meant that struggle was rarely externalized. When someone like Bamonte faced internal pressure, it did not announce itself. Years later, when he rejoined The Cure in 2022, the narrative was quietly celebratory. He stepped back into the sound with ease, as if the years away had never happened. The band described the subsequent performances as some of the strongest in their history. For fans, his presence felt reassuring, a return to balance. But returns can be complicated. Re-entering a role that once defined you can revive purpose. And time, which had passed gently for audiences, had moved differently for the person carrying the instruments. What made this period particularly fragile was the contrast between public perception and private reality. To fans, Bamonte's return looked like a victory. To the band, it was a restoration of chemistry. To Bamonte himself, it was likely both alongside pressures no one else could fully see. He was no longer a young man standing at the beginning of a long career. He was someone who had already lived multiple versions of the same life. The body that once absorbed the grind of touring more easily now carried decades of wear. The mind that had always processed emotion inwardly had accumulated years of unspoken experience. And yet, he kept going. He played more than 90 shows after rejoining the band. He stood under lights that had followed him for most of his adult life. He delivered the same emotional precision audiences expected, even as the demands of that precision increased with age. This is where the story begins to narrow. Because while the world saw strength, continuity, and creative renewal, something else was happening beneath the surface, something that would only become visible in hindsight. At some point during this period, Perry Bamonte became ill. The band would later describe it simply as a short illness. No details were offered. No timeline was made public. There was no indication that this was a long, widely known condition. To the outside world, the shift from active musician to absence happened almost instantaneously. The lack of information is not a failure of transparency. It is a choice, one that reflects the kind of person Bamonte had always been. He did not make his private life a public narrative. Even at the end, he remained consistent. What we do know is this. His illness unfolded away from the stage, away from interviews, away from fan speculation, and as it progressed, the world kept assuming there would be more time. There would be another show, another tour announcement, another return. But there wasn't. The collapse, when it came, was not dramatic. It was quiet, and that quietness is what makes the final chapter so unsettling. Because it suggests that the most important part of Perry Bamonte's story, the moment when the music stopped, happened far from the place where everyone was still listening. In the weeks leading up to Perry Bamonte's death, the world around him continued to move as if nothing irreversible was approaching. There were no public cancellations attributed to him personally, no farewell statements, no final interviews framed as last words. To fans, and to much of the music press, life appeared to be unfolding normally, plans discussed in the future tense, tours imagined but not yet announced in detail, the assumption that time was still abundant. This is what makes the final stretch of his life so difficult to grasp. Somewhere behind closed doors, the rhythm had already begun to change. The illness the band would later describe as short did not announce itself loudly. There was no long public decline, no visible retreat from the world that might have prepared audiences for what was coming. If there were warnings, they were private ones noticed only by those close enough to see the small shifts that never reach headlines. Those who knew Bamonte best understood his instinct to keep moving forward. He had built his entire career on adaptability and endurance. When things became difficult, he adjusted. When pressure increased, he compensated. When circumstances changed, he filled the gap. That habit does not disappear easily. If anything, it makes moments of vulnerability harder to detect. In the final weeks, Perry Bamonte was no longer on stage, but the identity forged there did not simply switch off. Decades of touring had taught him to push through discomfort, to normalize exhaustion, to treat strain as part of the job. Illness, especially when it arrives quietly, can be folded into that same mental framework, something to manage rather than something to fear. What is clear is that his condition was not widely known. Fans continued to speak about the future. The band itself had spoken openly about plans extending into 2026. There was no public language of urgency, no sense that a chapter was closing. The absence of such signals suggests that even as his health changed, the idea of finality had not yet crystallized for the people watching from the outside. And perhaps not even for Bamonte himself. This period was marked by withdrawal not in the dramatic sense, but in the most ordinary one. Time spent at home rather than in transit. Days without the adrenaline of performance. Nights without the familiar structure of a set list and a crowd. For someone whose adult life had been shaped by movement, stillness can be disorienting. The stage had always provided a kind of clarity, a reason to be somewhere, a reason to push past the limits of the body. Away from it, the body's messages become harder to ignore. We do not know the exact conversations that took place during these weeks. We do not know what Bamonte was told about his condition, or what he believed about its trajectory. We do not know whether he expected recovery, improvement, or simply more time. What we do know is that there was no public farewell, no final note to fans, no announcement of a last performance, no framing of this moment as an ending. That silence is not accidental. It is consistent. Throughout his life, Perry Bamonte resisted narrative excess. He did not dramatize his presence, and he did not dramatize his absence. Even as his health declined, the world continued to speak about him in the future tense. And then, suddenly, there were no more weeks left to describe. The final days unfolded at home, away from the machinery of touring and the noise of performance. Christmas approached a time associated with reflection, memory, and closeness. For many, it is a moment when life slows, when the boundaries between past and present blur. For Bamonte, it would become the setting of his final chapter. The contrast is stark. A man who had spent decades standing beneath lights that illuminated him for thousands at a time would leave the world in a private space, surrounded not by amplifiers and instruments, but by ordinary domestic quiet. No crowd counted down the final moments. No encore was called for. No applause marked the transition. Just the narrowing of time. As the final day arrived, there was still no public sense that history was about to turn a page. The absence of spectacle did not mean the absence of significance. It meant that whatever happened next would belong almost entirely to those in the room. And to understand that moment, the true heart of this story, we have to move closer, past the weeks, past the assumptions, past the plans that never materialized. We have to step into the final 24 hours. The final 24 hours of Perry Bamonte's life did not unfold on a stage, in a hotel room, or under the pressure of a ticking tour schedule. They unfolded at home. According to the band's statement, he passed away quietly after a short illness during the Christmas period. There were no reports of emergency hospital transfers, no public accounts of frantic last-minute interventions. What is known is limited, but that limitation itself tells a story. By the final day, the world outside continued as usual. News cycles moved on. Fans were still discussing music, shows, the future. There was no sense beyond the walls of his home that time had narrowed to its smallest unit. Inside, it was different. Illness strips life of its abstractions. There are no plans, no long timelines, only the present moment, measured in hours, sometimes minutes. For someone who had lived by rehearsal schedules, sound checks, and set lists, the sudden simplicity of those final hours would have been profound. There is no verified record of final words, no documented last phone call, no farewell message posted into the void of the internet. What is clear is that Perry Bamonte did not die performing. He did not die traveling. He did not die surrounded by the machinery that had defined his working life. He died in stillness. At some point during that final day, the long arc of movement tours, flights, backstage corridors, endless nights of sound came to rest. The hands that had spent decades translating emotion into music were no longer needed for that task. When the moment came, it did not announce itself to the world. There was no immediate headline, no breaking alert. The transition from life to absence happened quietly, contained within a private space, witnessed only by those closest to him. Later, the announcement would use careful language. Passed away, at home, after a short illness. Each phrase closed a door rather than opened one. And in that choice of words, there is a final consistency. Perry Bamonte spent his life supporting sound rather than demanding attention. In his last hours, he did the same, leaving without spectacle, without explanation, without asking the world to look directly at him. The music stopped. The room stayed quiet. And only afterward did the world realize what it had lost. When the noise faded, what remained was not a mystery to solve, but a presence to remember. Perry Bamonte did not leave behind a legend built on spectacle. He left behind something quieter and, in many ways, rarer. A body of work shaped by restraint, a career defined by reliability, a life spent amplifying other voices while keeping his own measured and private. He was there at crucial moments in The Cure's evolution, helping translate emotion into sound without ever demanding to be the center of the story. For decades, audiences felt the results of his work without always knowing his name, and perhaps that was exactly how he understood his role. In his final hours, that philosophy did not change. There was no grand farewell, no last performance framed as an ending, just a man who had given most of his life to music, stepping away from it quietly, at home, during a season meant for reflection. Looking back, the lesson is not about tragedy. It is about how easily the essential can be overlooked while it is still present, how the people who hold things together often do so invisibly until they are no longer there to do it. Perry Bamonte's story reminds us that not all legacies announce themselves loudly. Some live on in the texture of songs, in the steadiness of performances, in the emotional continuity that fans feel without fully understanding why. And when those lives end, they do not need explanation. They need acknowledgement. In the end, the final moments of Perry Bamonte were not about how he died, but about how he lived, consistently, quietly, and in service of something larger than himself. And long after the room went silent, the sound he helped create is still playing.